One of the things that becomes your responsibility as you get older is to prepare your will or do some sort of planning for what's going to happen after you're gone. Whether that's as simple as, making sure your will is up to date and the right child is getting the right thing, naming beneficiaries on insurance policies, or creating an entire estate plan. Some others take this to another level, and they have a particular project or an endeavor or ministry or something that they want to get set up, get running, make sure that it endures after them. Whether it's, a community garden or a halfway house or a food pantry or something like that, something that will continue long after they're gone. When people see it, they can say, oh yeah, so-and-so got this going. Others may do it as a scholarship fund and want to leave money for those who are engaging in a particular field of study. Some people want a building named after them, or at least to get a plaque on a wall somewhere. And of course, a great many people sadly do none of the above and say, well, the kids will figure it out, which is a horrible thing for the kids to try to figure out. But does legacy planning happen for the church as well? Do we ever think about the legacy that we leave to Redeemer after we have passed from this earth? You have enjoyed, in some cases, decades of word and sacrament ministry here. How are you going to ensure that that continues on? What things have you always said, I wish our church did more of whatever? And now in your legacy, you're going to make sure that that can happen. And what steps do you need to take now to make sure that happens? See, a lot of the best practices of leaving a legacy have kind of fallen by the wayside in the last few decades. It used to be very common for a church to be named as a beneficiary in someone's will. To leave 10% of one's estate to the church was not at all uncommon. Sometimes that would be done as a bequest or an endowment for outreach or youth or education or something like that. Some people took out life insurance policies, a small policy that would then be annuitized and provide a perpetual stream of income for their congregation. Others might be downsizing and moving away, and when they sell off the big house in New Jersey for the little house down in the Carolinas, they'll give a portion of that to make sure that the church continues. There's all sorts of ways that we can see to the church's continuity, ways that we have historical precedent for, and new and exciting ways as well. And it's really not a new problem or an American problem. This goes back to the time of the apostles. We see that today in the first chapter of Acts. Acts 1 begins with the ascension, which we celebrated Thursday. Christ has returned to be at the Father's right hand. He has given the disciples their commission, whether you read it from Matthew and the Great Commission, as we call Matthew's version, or we read it here in Acts about being witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and unto the ends of the earth, they've been given a charge. They are going to be his witnesses. But how are they supposed to do that? So they gather back in that upper room where they had been gathering, and these 11 remaining disciples, plus about 120 other believers, have to figure out how to carry on. How are we going to do this now that Jesus is no longer with us? Is our task any different? We've been given the same mission: to go and make disciples of all nations, or in the way we phrased it, to joyfully make known the good news of Jesus Christ through word and deed to those in our communities. How are we going to do that? Who's going to do it? When is it going to be done? Well, these are all things that need to be wrestled with. Where do we even begin to figure this out? How about we start where the disciples did? When they got back to that upper room, what did they do? Do you remember? They devoted themselves constantly to prayer. Does that mean they were sitting there with hands folded, eyes shut, and heads bowed? How do you get anything done if that's what you're doing all the time? That's not what being constant in prayer is about, or to pray without ceasing, to use Paul's words. It's more of an attitude of constantly talking to God and seeking his direction, being in his word, listening to what he has to say, and wrestling with the various things that are going on. And these 11 plus the other 120 are all doing that up in that upper room. And then Peter stands up. Now, this is Peter before Pentecost, so he's still not quite as eloquent as he will become, but he begins by giving them a history lesson. Remember Judas? Even though he was a betrayer, he was one of our number and had a share in this ministry. And now that share is vacant. Then Luke fills in some rather graphic details about Judas's demise, but this was all foretold through the Psalms and through the prophets, that Judas would need to be replaced. But by whom? As we look at Redeemer, have we lost members to moving away or death or simply dropping away? Who's going to replace them? Who's going to take up that share of ministry? What else has happened to us in our 73 years? In 72, 73 years, the time that we have been here. If we go back into our history, can we find what we need to move forward? Probably not. Because is this the world of Pastor Rudolph? Pastor Padal? Pastor Diamond? Has it changed even in the 15 years I've been here? Remember where we were at 5 years ago? First week of June 5 years ago, we were just able to finally get back together with every other pew roped off and sitting 6 feet apart. It's not the same world that it was when the church was founded. So how did we get to where we are now? And what challenges do we have now that we may not have had back then? What mistakes were made in the past? And how do we avoid them going forward? Those are all things that we need to figure out. And the disciples had the same thing going on. Okay, we have to replace Judas, but let's make sure that it's not another betrayer. So they set up some qualifications. It has to be someone who has been with us since the beginning. Someone who is a witness to what Jesus said and, more importantly, what Jesus did. He must become a witness with us of his resurrection. That's the criteria. That's the mission. To make known that sin and death is over. Christ has conquered. So who's got the qualifications to do this? Well, they look around that group of 120, and how many do they find that meet the qualifications? 2. We look around our 50, and we might find, basing it on the same percentages, 0.84. So that begs the question, does God only call the qualified, or does he qualify those he calls? We don't know anything about Matthias. He's not mentioned until the first chapter of Acts. We have lists of all those who followed Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthias does not make the list. And yet he had been following since the beginning. He was a witness to the resurrection. And so he has had the experience and the training to carry out the mission that the disciples are called to carry out. I wonder, how much time do we spend training our church leaders? Is that something we should be doing? Saying, if you want to lead, you need to be in Bible study, you need to be in worship, you need to be a witness with us of these things. But the disciples find Matthias and Justus or Barsabbas, and they say, okay, Lord, you know everything. You know everyone's hearts. You know which of these two is going to be the replacement for Judas. So show us whom you have chosen. And how did the disciples figure out which one God has chosen? It's a roll of the dice. They cast lots. Does that sound like a good way of choosing a church leader? I'll take the Redeemer directory and take my, Dungeons and Dragons dice, the D12 or D20 or something, and give that a roll, and whatever number go to number 18, and okay, that's our new president. Yes. I knew he would get at least one vote, but is that trusting in the Spirit, or is that foolishness? Could go either way, but can God work through something as simple as the casting of lots? Can he work through simple water, through bread and through wine? So taking a vote, the equivalent of casting lots, is just as valid. But probably the most important point here is that after praying, after saying these are the qualifications, after saying why they needed this person in this position, they acted. They did something about it. I just got done an online course that was kind of intense because at the end of each lesson, they had these GYOB exercises. GYOB means get off your butt. And so I had to go out and actually practice the things that I had been learning for the previous week, and then report back to the instructor exactly what my experiences were with doing these various exercises. When was the last time you were at a Bible study that gave you specific things that you were supposed to do in the coming week based on that Bible study, and report back to the Bible study leader the next week? Has anyone been in one of those?
Yeah.
Are they helpful, harmful? I think doing those exercises was probably the hardest part of that lesson plan. To actually put the theory into practice is tough. And yet, I probably learned more from doing those exercises than I did from all the instructional videos and sheets and sheets and sheets of paper I had to read and all that. The same is true for us as a church. We can make plans, we can check demographics, we can have Bible study after Bible study on various things, but if it's not being put into practice, if we never get off our butts and actually do it, what's the point? And so the disciples today show us we start with prayer, we list out what needs to be done, we end with prayer, and we act. Because God had a plan for how his church was going to grow. Matthias would replace Judas. A former persecutor named Saul would become the greatest missionary and bring the gospel to Europe. An obscure German monk in 1517 would restore the gospel in its fullness, truth, and purity. And he's still got a plan for his church today. How will you make sure that our congregation continues to joyfully share the good news of Jesus Christ in word and deed with those in our community? What kind of legacy will you leave behind here? Well, it all begins and it all ends, that whole Alpha and Omega thing. It begins and it ends with prayer. So why don't we pray now?